Hello guys, in this video I'm going to show you how I made this simple ocean and cliffs terrain base, which will enable you to make a force perspective diorama for small model aircraft. So without further ado, let's get going. I took this inset from a picture frame, which is fairly small, and cut 2 layers of XPS foam to go inside it. With hindsight, this base could have been quite a bit smaller, to be honest, but I like the fact that it's a pre-made frame there. So that was all stuck together using some PVA glue. Then I used some other XPS foam to make the cliffs, and I wasn't quite sure how much of the scene I wanted to be cliffs and how much I wanted to be ocean. This is just a spare bit of XPS foam. I think I used this to package my 1/32 scale Lancaster when I shipped it from Malaysia. I think that's what the little curve cutout in it is there, that's where the fuselage sat. Anyway, once I was happy, I cut a triangular piece off there. Of course, for diorama, it's always good to have edges like the cliff face here, which are not parallel or perpendicular to the edges of the base. It's always good to have them diagonal. Then the next step really was just making this look a little bit more like a cliff face and a bit less like a lump of foam. So we need variation in various directions. Obviously we need some ins and outs. That's the technical name. We also need some ups and downs as well from the top. So it was really just a case of making some cuts, pulling bits of foam out. The great thing about this stuff is it doesn't make too much of a mess when you do that. At this point I'm not looking for texture, I'm purely looking for shape. And I'm keeping in mind that I can always remove more, but it's quite a lot harder to stick it back on again. You can stick it back on, but in fact I do in a minute, but it is just a bit more annoying. So when I'm making those vertical cuts there, I'm trying not to make them all absolutely parallel, not to make them all absolutely vertical. But I am trying to make the cliffs wider at the base. I don't want any overhanging cliffs really. I know you do get overhangs of course, but in the big picture you generally don't have a massively overhanging cliff for a large area. Here's our initial result. And of course, while we've got some indentations there, we've still got some quite flat areas, so it can be useful as well to stick on some of those parts you've cut off back on elsewhere, just to break up that line again. So it's time to stick that to the base with some PVA glue. Next thing we need to do is to make some water. We're going to put the water and the cliff on all together at the same time, and various things you can do with this. You can use resins and so on, but I am going to use the good old toilet paper technique. It sounds silly, but it works really well, I find. You can use any toilet paper. I mean, this one's got some, I don't know what it's got in, like thistles or something. But anyway, it doesn't matter if it's got patterns on it because you can get rid of them. So we soak the entire base in this PVA water mix. Then we add the sheets of paper. I tend to add them one at a time, or certainly one level thick at a time. As I say, you don't need to worry about any patterns in the paper, and you don't need to worry about any edges either, because you can see here the paper quickly sucks up that glue, and you can soon lose those edges. At this stage I'm just making sure everything's soaked in glue, and I'm just sort of dabbing it down, stippling it down, and then as we keep doing that, the wrinkles in the paper will form our waves. So it might not look like it at the moment because this is just the first layer, but as I put the next layers on, I am going to try to keep those waves going in parallel with the cliff face, because of course that's the direction the waves will be going. You might have seen this technique in some of my previous videos, so I used it in the Seeking video, and I also used it a long time ago in the Spitfire versus the HE 111 video, where I had the 111 with the burning engine, if you remember that video. If you don't, I'll try to remember to put a link in the top corner now. So there we go, you can see that a bit better now. Now I've got a bit more paper and a bit more glue on. stippling it down, keep adding paper, keep adding glue. Of course, I have to remember here that this is approximately 1 to 2000 scale, so even a relatively small ripple in the paper is going to be quite a large wave. And of course, I don't want a tsunami. And you have to be really careful, I find here, not to inadvertently end up making these waves parallel to the edges. I kept finding myself wanting to sort of curve them around to fit, whereas really I want them to go parallel to the cliffs and just go off the edge as if they carry on seamlessly forever. And there we go, there is our ocean with the ripples and waves in place. I can see a bit of purple foam through this. In that top corner there I'll add some more paper, but I'm not worried about seeing the foam because it's all going to get so many layers of paint that we'll never see any of it. It's still quite wet, so I can tidy some things up if I need to. And again, if you tear the paper, you can just put a small patch of paper over, a bit more glue, and just go over it. Right, that's all been allowed to dry now for a good 24 hours. And I'm going to use my favourite AK acrylic paste. This is a dry ground terrain paste. But it has just a gritty enough texture that it works really well for the cliff faces. And that's why I said before, don't worry too much about the texture of the blue foam, just the shape. So I'm spreading this on here, trying to keep it fairly thin, but not worrying if it goes on a bit thick. And I'm trying to use the tool in a vertical motion because again, any marks on the tool there will just look like natural texture in the rock. I suppose if you were modelling a cliff which has lots of horizontal or diagonal striations, then you could equally use a horizontal or diagonal motion with the tool. You can see as well, as I've put the paste over those indentations there, quite a bit of those indentations have been lost. So that's why it's quite important to make them a little bit bigger than you might actually need when you're cutting that foam initially. And here is our finished cliff face. Actually, it's not quite finished. I haven't done that small rock in the water yet, have I? And for some reason at this stage, I didn't do the ground at the top in this texture paste. I came back through that later. I'm not quite sure what I thought I was doing or what I thought I was going to do, but I just put the texture all over the top of that as well. Talking of not sure what I was doing, for some reason I gave my ocean a coat of Tamiya XF1 black. I think this was because I had some left over after painting something else in the airbrush, and I thought, well, what can I do? I know, let's base coat it in black. It doesn't harm it, but to be honest, I wouldn't really bother doing that. What I have base coated in black though is the cliffs, and then I've given them a light airbrushing of white. And you can see there I've now finally got that texture paste on the top of the cliffs as well. This is probably the point where this looks the least like any cliffs you've ever seen, but it will get better. So I use some artist acrylic paints. This is burnt umber to paint that texture on top. While it was drying, I used some white acrylic paint. Again, it was just cheap artist acrylic paint, and heavily dry brush those cliff faces. Remember, they've had a base coat of black and just a light dusting of white from the airbrush, and now a heavy pure white dry brush. I've also tried to do that in a downwards motion so that those dark shadows tend to stay below. In some cases I had to go from the bottom, but that's what I've tried to do where I could. And there are our white cliffs of Dover. Now, time to paint the ocean. I got together a few acrylic paints. So we have white, a sort of beigey colour, good old burnt umber, and a sort of a range of sort of bluey colours with a turquoise there in the middle. There's no real fixed pattern for this. I'm going to be wet blending them, so you can keep making corrections and just go with the flow really. I'd started with the lightest, which is the beigey sand colour. This is one time in this painting where you do have to be careful, because you probably do want to make sure that you get it all the way into the corner. Maybe use a smaller brush than I am, because you don't want any of that black or the unpainted toilet paper showing through. So a nice beach there at the bottom of our cliffs. Straight after that, while everything is still wet, I came in with the burnt umber. I didn't even clean my brush in between colours. I'm just putting the burnt umber on here. At the moment this does look a bit stripy, but that will be changed. Because of that, because we are going to wet blend them, we do need to work reasonably quickly. We don't need to hurry, but we do need to not dilly-dally. Next up was the lightest of my blue colours, but it did look a bit too bright. So I mixed a bit of the burnt umber into it. Then followed the exact same process as the previous two colours. I know this looks quite a mess at the moment. Now you could continue with all the other colours and then do the blending at the end, but I wanted to do the blending now just to show you how it works, and of course the sooner you do the blending the easier it is. So I've got a clean brush here, dipped in some water, not soaked, just dipped, and I'm going along here on the boundaries between the colours, blending them in, occasionally going back and just cleaning my brush out. Going backwards and forwards between the different layers. I think you can see there straight away it's starting to look a lot better. I've got a bit too much water on my brush there. And those ugly band lines between the colours have disappeared. We can go both ways. We can bring some of the lighter sand colour further out into the ocean, and equally we can bring some of the ocean colours further up towards the cliffs. Nature has lots of variety. So I think you can see the difference quite clearly there between the left and the right half of the cliffs, the difference that blending technique makes. So I moved on here with the extra colours. You do have to have a little bit of faith in the process, because it does look dog ugly at first. But you know, you can always go back, you can change things, you're wet blending. Worst comes to the worst, you can paint over it all in black and start again. Here are all my initial colours put down. You can see actually in the deeper ocean there, even though I haven't blended them yet, they already look fairly well blended. But I will still go and blend them with some water. I did also introduce a small amount of black into some of the colours at the deeper end of the ocean. And here you can see the end result once everything has dried. Now obviously that's dried matte. It doesn't look bad, but there are a couple of quite deep areas of black dark paint, so I wanted to break those up a bit. So here's a light blue mixed with some brown, just to try to break up that area a bit. Of course all of this paint is matte, so we do need to give it some kind of gloss effect. You can use PVA, you can use Mod Podge, but I like this Liquitex gloss gel. It's really quite thick stuff, and I've used it on a good 4 or 5 bases like this in the past, and I've still got a good half of the pot left. I tend to whack it on with an old brush. At this stage I don't worry about the direction, just getting everything covered, and this gel will dry clear. Then once you've got a good amount on, normally I'd cover the whole base, but I'll just show you with a smaller amount, you can start stippling in the correct direction. So of course in our case we want those waves to be moving towards the cliff face. There we are at the end of our first layer, and all we need to do now is wait for that gel to dry. Once it's dried, you get something like this, really quite glossy, and I tend to add a second layer, which is what I did here. Again, making sure I work it into the right up to the cliffs, or wherever you want your tide to be. And here we are after the second layer has dried, or almost dried. There are a couple of cloudy bits there that haven't quite dried yet. And at this point I thought the result looked okay, but the ocean does look a little bit tropical. Particularly near the cliffs there, it's a bit too bright, a bit too blue. It reminds me of Malaysia and Thailand and places like that, rather than the English Channel. So I wanted to fix that before I moved ahead. I wasn't sure how it would turn out having 2 coats of gloss on already, but as it was, it turned out fine. Basically, I went back in with the turquoise mixed with a small amount of black and quite a lot of brown. And I wanted to remove that really bright blue and quite a lot of that beige sand colour as well, to be honest, from the base of the cliff. And there we go, I think that looks a bit better. Of course, being darker, the ocean does look a bit deeper there too. Of course, there's no reason that you have to brush paint acrylic paints on here. You could airbrush them as well. In fact, that's what I did for my Sea King diorama. Of course, because I put the extra layer of paint down, that's dried matte, so I need another layer of gloss over the top. This time, while I was doing it, I did a very, very fine stippling motion over the entire ocean there, which I thought worked quite well. But I'm getting ahead of myself because the grass has appeared on the hillside. So how did I do that? Quite simple. I took some of Woodland Scenic's blended green turf and their burnt turf, burnt grass. I keep these things in plastic bags because the stuff goes everywhere and the bags always leak once they're open. I mixed it together in some tin foil. Some slightly watered down PVA glue on the top of the cliff and on the top of those 2 small rocks, and just sprinkled it on. Now it doesn't really matter if you get it onto the ocean because it will drop off or brush off, but at the same time it's a bit of a pain, so you can try to avoid getting it on the ocean if at all possible. Sprinkle it on, tip it upside down, brush away the excess. And here's my turf at the end of that process, recollecting all the excess. And you can see that I've barely used any if you compare that to what I started with, so that can go straight back in the bag. Now this shot here, it does look like the gel has not dried, but it has. It's just the lights above my desk reflecting in it, and because I did that very fine stippling texture, you've got lots and lots of reflection here. It does look a lot better in real life than it does here right now. And I'm using some acrylic paint from AK, which I'm using to selectively paint whitecaps onto some of the bigger waves. I'm not indiscriminately dry brushing the entire thing by any means. You can see there I'm just putting a few whitecaps in. Okay, time to look at the final result. So there we go guys, I hope you enjoyed that how-to on making this terrain base. I really like the fact that the techniques here are really simple and the materials are quite basic as well. In fact, several of the materials I've used you could substitute for more common materials if you don't have them. So for example, the paste I used on the cliffs, you could probably use wall filler for that, and instead of the gel I used for the ocean, you could use PVA glue. So it's a nice accessible terrain project. Of course, if you've seen my last video, then you'll be able to guess what's going to be flying over these cliffs very shortly. That video is filmed and edited, it's just that if I included that material here, the video would be sort of 45 minutes long in total, and that's not a particularly good, entertaining video to watch, I think. But that will be uploaded later this week or at the weekend. Until then, let me say a huge thank you to all of you for watching, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Your ongoing support is massively appreciated guys, and I really enjoy the conversations we have both on the YouTube members page and on the Patreon page, so thank you very much. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments below, and until next time, have fun modelling.